Just want to say good evening and happy new year to everyone at CAS and everyone who's come in today. Um, this evening, I'm going to talk about the ways in which early prehistoric communities, so prehistoric communities in a relatively distant part of our past, sort of impacted on their environment, the way they structured and changed their environment. And I'm thinking particularly about impacts that humans had on plant communities. So we're going to be looking at forested environments and wetland environments in particular. And I'm going to be focusing on Britain during the early part of the Mesolithic or the Middle Stone Age. So to put this in its chronological context, the Mesolithic starts at about 11,300 years ago. That's just a few centuries after the end of the last ice age. And we're going to be looking mostly at the first 1,000 years or so of the Mesolithic. So roughly speaking, we're in the first sort of millennia, the first 1,000 years of the post-glacial period in Britain, give or take a century or so. Now, before I go on, oops. There we go. Before I go on, I do have a quick confession to make. This talk has evolved a little bit since I was invited to come and speak. I blame Christmas entirely for this and the opportunity to sit on the sofa and read a load of things that I've been meaning to read for most of last year. So because of this, what was advertised and what I'm actually going to say might diverge just a little bit in places. That said, the main focus of my talk is pretty much the same. I'm going to be discussing how various forms of human action created, modified, and maintained environments during the Mesolithic. Some of these actions were intentional, so things that people were doing specifically to manage or manipulate plant and animal populations. But many of the things that humans did, many of the impacts that humans had on their environment were also accidental. So things that were carried out by humans for other reasons, but that also structured their local environment and had effects on plant and animal communities. And it's these sort of unintended consequences and their effects on the environment that I'd like to focus on mostly this evening. And to do this, I'm going to take what's been described as a multi-species approach. This is an approach that comes out of anthropology. It's been developed within anthropology, particularly in America over the past decade or two. And it really just means paying more attention to the actions of things like plants and animals and seeing the world not just as the product of human agency, but as a result of ongoing interactions and relationships between humans and all the various non-human beings that we share our world with: plants, animals, the weather, all the sort of things that we're sort of constantly sort of engaged with and interact with, and thinking about the world and environments in particular as sort of being created and formed and maintained through these interactions. It's really just about, although we're still thinking about humans, but it's just not making humans the principal focus of our study, and maybe to sort of elevating the actions of non-humans to a slightly higher level. So taking more of an account of the things that non-humans do in their world and the effects they have on creating our world. And personally, I think that taking this approach, thinking more about non-humans and their interactions with humans, gives us a far better understanding of the character of Mesolithic environments and thinking about people's relationships to that environment. Now, during the Mesolithic, Britain was inhabited by communities of hunter-gatherers. So we're still, well, farming comes in at the very end of the Mesolithic, but the period we're looking at, we're still thousands of years away from the introduction of any form of agriculture. So there are no domesticated plants or animal species in Britain or any other parts of Northern Europe at this time. And instead, people lived by hunting wild animals such as elk, aurochs. Aurochs are now extinct, large prehistoric cattle, and large mammals like red and roe deer. They're also snaring and trapping small mammals like pine martens and hares. They're living by fishing and fowling, and obviously by harvesting a huge array of different wild plants. So things like they're harvesting things like hazelnuts when hazel appears in Europe. They're collecting sort of berries. They're harvesting the rhizomes of lots of wetland plants. Seed pods from things like water lilies and so forth. So they're subsisting purely through hunting and gathering, through the resources they're collecting from wild plant and animal species. And we don't generally think about people who live as hunter-gatherers as having much of an impact on the environment. And there's usually two reasons for this. There's two reasons that people will cite for why they don't really think that hunter-gatherers in general, and Mesolithic people in particular, had much of an impact on their environment. The first is the lack of agriculture. And in particular, the fact that people aren't cultivating domesticated plants. We tend to assume that farming is one of the key things that drives anthropogenic or humanly induced environmental change. And the second reason why we don't really think that hunter-gatherers make much of an impact on their environment is that we assume that they live in small communities. We often assume that they're very mobile, and so any impacts that they have on their surroundings, we also assume must be fairly small scale and wouldn't last very long. But this way of thinking about hunter-gatherers and their relationship with the environment, it goes right back to our early colonial past, when Europeans encountered hunter-gatherer communities in the Americas, in Africa, Asia, and Australasia. And as with so many of the achievements of indigenous peoples, Europeans just couldn't envisage that people who didn't live like them, people who didn't manage their landscape through farming, who in some cases did live in small groups, and in some cases were quite mobile, that didn't have what were obviously permanent settlements to inhabit. Europeans just really couldn't sort of get their heads around the idea that these people could have any sort of significant impact on the environment. And as a result, they tended to see landscapes in places like North America and Australasia as entirely natural. They describe them as pristine, as wildernesses, as a new Eden that's just been created for them, as places untouched by human hands. Now, this simply wasn't true. And by paying more attention to the accounts of indigenous peoples and working in collaboration with them, archaeologists and anthropologists now know that the environments in places like North America and Australia were the product of extensive forms of land management that had been practiced for millennia, for thousands of years prior to the arrival of humans. The practice that people are probably most familiar with is woodland management through burning. So the deliberate and controlled burning of understory within woodlands, which was carried out to keep these forest environments very open and to encourage the fresh growth of particular plant species. But we also have indigenous peoples were also burning wetlands and grasslands. They were doing this as a form of hunting strategy in some places to attract animals to these areas. They were also doing it to promote the growth of specific plant species. Some communities were carrying out woodland management practices such as coppicing, so cutting trees down close to the base, both close to their base, so which promotes the rapid growth of very long straight stems that can be harvested easily. Some communities were literally hand weeding, removing unwanted plants from stands of more economically useful plants. There are accounts of people sowing the seeds of non-domesticated plant species, and there's even cases of groups transplanting particular plants from one place to another. So lots of really intensive forms of land management that aren't farming, but still modify the environment. And these forms of plant management had a really significant impact on the character of the environments that these indigenous peoples inhabited. You know, the composition of forests in parts of North America, for example, was largely the result of indigenous methods of land management. It wasn't what we might describe as natural at all. And really the failure to recognize this has had catastrophic consequences to these environments. Yeah, we can see this in the large scale and uncontrolled forest fires that have been affected parts of the US and Canada. And it's also reflected in the changing species composition of these forests as well. Now, we've identified similar practices in the archaeological record for the Mesolithic in both Britain and across most of Northern Europe. And probably the clearest and certainly the most widespread evidence comes from pollen records that document forms of woodland management. And what these tend to show are that they tend to generally begin with the pollen record showing small-scale openings in woodlands. So this would be sort of declines in the pollen of the main sort of arboreal taxa. And this has either been caused by trees falling naturally, but maybe also by the deliberate felling of trees by Mesolithic communities. There's no reason why Mesolithic people wouldn't also be felling the trees themselves. So, and these openings, by whichever means have been created, they're then being maintained through repeated episodes of burning. And the pollen records detect this in terms of much higher inputs of microscopic charcoal into sediments, but also then we see the response of plant communities to this burning and to the clearing events as well. So the promotion of certain taxa, certain plant species that are encouraged by burning, but also plant species that are encouraged by greater amounts of light reaching the woodland floor. So we have really good evidence that Mesolithic people are deliberately maintaining and managing clearings in the woodlands, clearings that they may be creating themselves. And we think this is carried out either to promote the growth of particular plant species that were important as sources of food, so plants such as hazel, or they were carried out to attract animals to these clearings where they could then be hunted. So the idea is that by generating lots of fresh new growth of young trees, that will attract species of browsing mammals like elk and deer, which then makes them easier to hunt. And in fact, both of those interpretations probably hold true, and there's no reason why people weren't carrying out these woodland clearance events for both reasons. We also know that Mesolithic people were deliberately burning wetland vegetation, particularly reed beds around lakes and reed swamps, and they're doing this in some cases to create clearings at lake edges where they're carrying out lots of activities. Or they're doing this in some cases probably to promote the growth of particular plant species. So if you burn reed beds, after they've been growing for a few years, reed beds will generally sort of contain lots of other species which are sort of growing in and amongst the reeds. And if hunter-gatherers, if Mesolithic people want to harvest reeds and want to promote good growth of reeds, what they'll do is burn the reed bed off. That will encourage the fresh growth of reeds. You'll get lots of long, very straight, very tall reed stems, which they can then harvest and use as materials. And although it's debated a bit, there is some hints, at least, that Mesolithic communities, or some Mesolithic communities, were practicing forms of woodland management in terms of coppicing. So as I said, coppicing is simply cutting down trees close to their base, and the trees respond by sending up long, straight stems, which grow very, very quickly. That's how the tree's sort of survival mechanism, if you like, and then people can come along and harvest those. You get lots of very handy, straight, long stems, all of similar sort of diameters, and you can use them for making an array of tools. And these forms of plant management span much of the Mesolithic. We see them on some of the earliest sites in Britain, and we see them at sites at the very end of the period. So it's happening throughout the Mesolithic. And it's not just restricted to the Mesolithic either. There is convincing evidence now for anatomically modern humans modifying their environment through burning in the Upper Paleolithic. And in some very sort of research just published this week, there's also a very strong case made for Neanderthals practicing similar forms of plant management, again through deliberate controlled episodes of burning. So there is significant antiquity to these forms of plant management. But while we've been very good within archaeology at identifying forms of deliberate management, what we're sort of less good at is really accounting for the other ways in which humans affect their environment, all the sort of unintended responses of plants and animals to the actions of humans. And we really need to think about these, because environments aren't just shaped through deliberate human action. More often than not, the environments are much more messy. They're maintained and they change through a myriad of different interactions between humans, plants, and animals, which were never necessarily planned or intentional, but can have a significant effect on the environment. And we just take a quick hypothetical example. If we think about a group of Mesolithic people arriving at a site and they cut down trees to build a house or other structures, that clearly is an intentional act, but it also unintentionally changes the local environment. It creates openings in the woodland. This then promotes new plant growth as plants colonize this space. So we'd see lots of ruderal taxa or weeds coming into sort of areas of disturbed ground. We'd see young saplings start to develop within these clearings over a few years. You'd maybe see increase in ground flora as well. And this could all potentially bring animal populations into these spaces too, to sort of graze or browse on this new plant growth. And if people keep doing the same thing over generations, and we know that Mesolithic groups often revisited the same sites over decades or even centuries, then it would start to gradually structure the surrounding forest. And obviously, this is quite a localized change. We're talking about like a small group of people cutting down some trees to make a single structure, or a small group of structures. But it's the cumulative effect of these and other actions that are being undertaken sort of repeatedly across landscapes that would start to have a significant impact on the wider environment. And although most archaeologists don't often think about this, there's a really interesting account written by a group of archaeologists in Ireland a few years ago, where they talked about how the effects that humans had on the Mesolithic on the woodland in Mesolithic Ireland. And one of the things about Ireland is that there were no large mammals on Ireland during the Mesolithic, and wild boar were brought onto Ireland by Mesolithic people. And as they say, the effects of bringing an animal like wild boar into Ireland would have a massive impact on the Irish Mesolithic forests. So these unintentional actions can have massive consequences on the environment. So if we don't think about these, these unintended impacts, then we'll always be underestimating the effects that humans had on their environment. There's another couple of reasons why I think we need to think beyond deliberate forms of plant management and animal management as well. First, it makes us a lot more aware of the actions of non-humans and their importance in structuring environments in the past. And I realise that quote and that photo, they're no relationship to each other. I just really like the photo of those two dogs. So just have to imagine these are dogs who are creating some sort of environment through webs of their social relations. On a more serious note, I suppose, as archaeologists studying the Mesolithic, we tend to think about plants and animals in quite a passive way. So we think about plants as things that people gather, as animals things that people hunt. We don't really think about them as playing an active role in the environment generally. Like I say, we tend to see them as quite passive. But when we start thinking about how humans might inadvertently change or have an impact on their environment, it makes us focus a lot more on how plants and humans respond, how they act back on humans and how they interact with each other. And this is important because we know from modern ecological studies that environments can be actively created and maintained through interactions between humans and non-humans, which again aren't necessarily planned or deliberate. So if we want to understand how environments in the past came into being, we really need to pay more attention to this non-human agency. The second reason we need to think like this is that this change in perspective, this thinking about the agency of plants and animals, also helps us to think about how Mesolithic communities might have understood their environment, how they perceived different plant and animal species that they shared their world with. We know from anthropological studies that humans develop understandings of plants and animals through their encounters with them, particularly through their experiences of plant and animal action and interaction. So, for example, Colin Turnbull, the anthropologist, describes how farming communities living in the Ituri forest in Africa, really feared the forest. They saw it as a place inhabited by evil beings, and that the forest itself was actively hostile to them. It was a malign presence in their lives. And part of the reason for that, in the way that he describes it, is how the forests interacted with the farmers. So the farmers would clear areas of forest for their settlements and fields by cutting down trees and burning the understory vegetation. But the forest responds by regenerating, and it does it really quickly. So people, these farming communities are constantly having, or were constantly having, to maintain these clearings, right, removing the regenerating sort of forest vegetation. And this was a struggle that they always lost, because the soil fertility was quite poor. And so the farmers would have to abandon both the fields and their settlements every few years and go through the whole process again. And while they're doing this, they will be aware of the fact that their former fields and villages will rapidly swallowed up by the forest. So they took this quite personally. They came to see the forest as something malicious, as something that was deliberately fought against them. And that was an understanding that came about because of the way that they saw and perceived the forest acting on them. And we see there's a similar example from accounts of the Highland Maya in Guatemala, and they describe like wild plants as laughing as they encroach onto cultivated ground and attacking farming tools and harming people. Um, Simply because, again, the Highland Maya were constantly engaged in this battle with a forest environment that was constantly trying to encroach back onto their settlement. So we can start to think about how Mesolithic communities may have understood plants and animals by thinking about the ways that humans encountered certain species and how these species acted back on them. And we'll get back to that point later on. Okay, so let's start illustrating this with some actual archaeology. And to do this, we're going to be looking at the Mesolithic landscape around what we call the Paleo Lake Flixton in the Eastern Vale of Pickering in North Yorkshire. It's called the Paleo Lake Flixton because it no longer exists. It's no longer a lake. It's a fossilized lake, if you like. The area is now largely under agricultural sort of management. It's a sadly drying out peat bog. But we know that sort of from the late glacial interstadial, so several thousand years before the Mesolithic, there was a large lake at the eastern end of the Vale of Pickering, this lake we call Lake Flixton, and it acted as a significant focus for human activity throughout the Mesolithic. There are around 25 known sites around the former lake and on 2 islands that are present within. And I say around 25 because I swear that number keeps changing every time I give a talk. What makes this area so important is that during the course of the Mesolithic, it gradually infills with organic sediment, so with peats and with detrital muds. And over time, these completely infill the lake. But during the Mesolithic, they're just accumulating around the edges of the lake and within the lake basin. And these sediments created an oxygen-free and anoxic environment. And that environment has preserved a whole range of organic materials that wouldn't normally survive in a dryland archaeological context. And this includes archaeological materials, so particularly things made out of plant and animal remains, and also the waste generated from their manufacture. So it gives us a really good insight into the lives of Mesolithic people, whereas on a dryland site, we would often just find maybe small it's also really good for understanding the Mesolithic environmental past, the environmental history of this landscape, because the same sediments have also preserved a record of the local plant communities. And this is in the form of plant pollen and plant macrofossils. So macrofossils will be anything from seeds and fruits all the way up to entire trees. And these, again, have been preserved within the lake sediments. And from these, we can reconstruct the composition and the character of the vegetation of the environment within and around the lake itself. Now, we know from this environmental record, from this environmental data, that by the start of the Mesolithic, there would have been areas of woodland forming on the dry ground around the lake. Now, it wasn't not all of the landscape was wooded. There were fairly large open areas at this sort of stage in the Mesolithic, but we still had areas of what we might describe as closed woodland. These consist mostly of species of birch tree, sort of silver birch and downy birch, species of willow, and also Eurasian and aspen. But we also see a variety of other smaller shrubs growing in these environments too. Now, this is a very sort of open canopy woodland. It's not the sort of woodland or forest that we generally are used to seeing in parts of Britain. Because these species of birch, willow and aspen don't form a particularly dense canopy, there's a lots of lights that are coming through and reaching light that's coming through and reaching the woodland floor, and this allows the growth of a really rich understory of particularly of ferns, but also grasses and a huge variety of other ground flora which are reflected in the pollen record. We also know that we've got birch, willow, and aspen trees growing at the lake shore, so they're sort of reaching probably out over the lake. And amongst those, we've got plants like nettles, we've got wetland species of ferns, and a huge suite of different plants that are suited to wet and sort of waterlogged or boggy grounds. And then as we sort of move into the lake itself, we have dense beds of reeds and sedges and other wetland plants. These are growing in relatively shallow water. It's a very, very diverse and species-rich swamp environment. And then as we go further into lake, into deeper water, these reed beds and sedge beds give way to areas of aquatic plants like pondweeds and water lilies. Now, it's tempting to see the environment at this point as being natural, as being somehow sort of untouched by human hands. Um, But it's already being structured and changed through the actions of non-humans. Without any form of human intervention, non-humans are already structuring and changing this environment. And we can see some of this archaeologically. We've got this guy here, the Eurasian beaver, which we know is active in the landscape because we have wood with evidence of beaver gnawing on it, beaver working on it, which we find in very early deposits around the lake. These guys would have a massive effect on the local environment. They are most definitely felling trees in this Mesolithic landscape. The environment, the example there on the screen comes from the early Mesolithic site of Starkar at the western end of the lake, which we'll talk about in a bit. It was originally thought when the site was excavated in the 1940s that this tree had been felled by humans, possibly as a way of creating some sort of opening through the reed beds at the edge of the lake. But it's now pretty much, everyone pretty much agrees that it was brought down by beavers, worked by Brian Lee Coles, looking at the sort of what were thought to be axe facets on the tree actually show it was brought down by beavers. So beavers are active in this landscape. They're felling trees, and they're probably also generating coppice. We have coppice stems, mostly from willow, some of which also predate Mesolithic activity in this landscape. And some of this is probably resulting from beavers felling trees and the stumps then producing coppice. Now we often think about beavers as animals that modify water levels and animals that modify woodlands, but they also have a massive effect on wetland plant species too. So ecological studies have shown that beaver grazing on wetland plants will radically reduce the volume or biomass of lake edge reed beds and so forth, but it also promotes greater species diversity and richness. So they'd be creating very distinctive spaces within the wetlands around the lake. And beavers also encourage the growth of herbaceous plants on the dry ground as well, plants that are attracted to the ground disturbance that's caused by trees being felled and so on. So beavers are sort of massively structuring and having a huge effect on this landscape. And other animals are also having an effect on the environment too. So we know that there are species like red and roe deer, there are elk and there are aurochs. So we're looking at browsing and grazing species. These would also be impacting on vegetation. They would be affecting places where forest was able to grow, and also affecting those areas where forest couldn't grow, but just simply by the fact that they would be browsing on young saplings. Wild boar are active in this landscape. Wild boar will make a huge impact on areas of woodland and create lots of ground disturbance as well. And all of these actions of non-humans are reflected in the pollen record of the period. We see disturbance events within the environment which occur around this time, which you think are probably deriving from the actions of animals. So humans are coming into a landscape that's already being shaped through a whole series of interactions between plants and animals. And humans really just sort of enter this mix, really. They arrive and they also begin to change the environment through a whole series of different actions. And we'll illustrate this with a couple of examples, starting with the aforementioned site of Starkar. So this is the most extensively investigated site around the lake. It lies on a peninsula on the western side of the lake. It was originally excavated or discovered and then partially excavated in the mid 20th century by Professor Graham Clark from the University of Cambridge. There were small scale excavations in the 1980s and 90s, and then very detailed paleoenvironmental work by Petra Dark, who's now at Reading University. And then over the past decade or so, there's been large-scale excavations and further environmental work that's been carried out as part of a joint project involving universities of Chester, York and Manchester. And this work's provided us with a really detailed record of human activity at the site and also of the local environment. So we know that the site was occupied for around about eight centuries, around about 800 years, from around about 11,300 years ago, right at the beginning of the Mesolithic. We know from field walking and test pitting that activity covers around about 2.5 hectares. So it's a large area occupied for a long period of time. We have on what would have been the dry ground above the lake shore, we have what looks like an area of settlement. And there we have things like structures, which only survive as arrangements of post holes now, sadly. We have activity areas within and around these structures, which are represented by scatters of worked flint and flint working debitage, small quantities of animal bone as well that's been deposited in activity areas around these structures, also along the wetland shore. And there's also a large midden deposit. People were depositing waste on part of the dryland part of the site, forming a large midden. And there's also activity, people also carrying out tasks within the wetlands. They constructed a series of large wooden platforms or trackways sequentially at different points during the occupation of the site. They're using the lake edge area as for procuring wetland plants, which they're using craft activities. And we also see evidence for what we might describe as ritualized or prescribed forms of deposition also within the wetlands, particularly focused on very sort of prescribed ways of disposing of animal remains, and particularly the remains of red deer. And we'll talk a little bit about that later if I get a move on and finish this talk, actually. And what's particularly useful for us is there's also a large assemblage of wood at Starcar, some of which is used to construct the platforms. But there's also a lot of woodworking waste, and there's also a lot of natural wood as well. So there's branches, there's coppice, and there's even whole trees that have accumulated or just built up at the lake edge. And so this gives us an unparalleled record for the way humans were managing and modifying areas of woodland. And we can just talk through these briefly. So to start with, they're certainly having an impact on local woodlands. People are harvesting the coppice that's been produced by beavers or produced as trees have fallen naturally. They're also using either larger coppice or possibly they're cutting down saplings or very young trees, which they're using at the frames of buildings and other structures. We see this in the size and the arrangements of the post holes. And they're utilising willow and aspen trees for building large wooden trackways and platforms and for a variety of other tasks. But they're quite selective in the trees they use. From the diameter of the tree trunks, we can tell these aren't fully mature trees. So they tend to be taking down trees which are maybe, it's hard to tell, maybe a few decades old, but certainly not fully grown. And they're also avoiding trees that are growing at the lake edge, and instead they seem to be taking trees from more closed areas of woodland away from the shore. Now, some of these trees may just have fallen naturally, so in some cases it does look like the trees have fallen naturally and have just been utilised by humans. But in some cases, at least, these trees are also being felled. People are also avoiding felling birch trees. There's very little evidence for the use of birch wood. People seem to be focusing specifically on willow and aspen, whereas they use birch for its bark, which doesn't involve killing the trees. So there's lots of impacts people are having on the woodland. They're also changing growing conditions for other plants around the sites. They're causing a lot of ground disturbance by digging post holes for houses and other structures. They sometimes dig out a shallow hollow around that form the base of their structures as well. So they're breaking sort of ground at the site. As I said before, they're middening waste that includes remains of animal carcasses across part of the site. Some of this they're burning, and this is going to have quite a noticeable effect on the soil nutrients that are present within those parts of the site. They're lighting fires on the ground, which are burning vegetation at a small scale, and they generally just be disturbing plants and the underlying soils as they traipse through the site, as they create paths within and around the site and away from it, as they drag animal carcasses onto the site and so forth. And quite quickly, these actions would have started to structure the local environment. We'd see more openings in the woodland where trees were being felled. The ongoing harvesting of coppice would prevent these stands from maturing, so the stems would always just be a few years old. And we'd see a higher proportion of older willow and aspen trees, and maybe a higher proportion of birch trees, because these trees simply aren't being cut down. So you would have a change in maybe the species composition, the abundance of birch in particular, but certainly a higher proportions of more mature trees. The pollen record also shows that ruderal taxa, the plants that we colloquially describe as weeds, also increase during the time the site is occupied. These are probably colonizing areas of disturbed ground around the site, and they're growing across the midden. And while we don't see it on the pollen record, species like nettle would probably get a lot more abundant, especially on the more sort of nutrient-enriched soils like the midden and carcass processing areas. And we see a huge range of weed taxa in the macrofossil record. So perhaps we could also suggest that species diversity is also increasing in response to human action. And there's also hints that the woodland diversity is also increasing. In the archaeological assemblage, you see much wider range of shrub species starting to be used for making tools in the later deposits. So it might be as well that the composition of the woodland itself is becoming more diverse. So over time, and remember, we're talking about sites occupied for 8 centuries, human action around Star-Kar and the responses of plants to those actions would have created and maintained a very particular environment, characterized by more open areas within the woodland, stands of young coppice stems, a diversity of ground flora, particularly species we refer to as weeds, and maybe also a more diverse range of shrub species too. And all of this is happening without any form of deliberate intent to structure this environment. Now, this isn't just happening at Star-Kar. We have at least 5 other sites. We certainly have 5 sites around the lake with radiocarbon chronologies that show they're occupied during the same time as humans are present at Star-Kar. So they're broadly contemporary areas of occupation. And now these haven't had anywhere near the same level of archaeological investigation. They've often been investigated by small-scale excavation and field walking, but we still see evidence for the same sorts of human actions that are having an effect on the environment. So we know that people have activity areas. We have evidence for some structures at some site. We know that people are butchering animal carcasses and processing them on the site and leaving the remains on the ground, changing the nutrient status of the soil. They're digging pits. They are lighting hearths and fires that we know from the environmental records are burning sort of the neighbouring vegetation. And again, these are all structuring the environment in a similar way to they're doing it around Star-Kar. And we can see this if we look at the pollen record for the site of Flixton School Field, which is on the southern shore of the lake. Human activity there coincides with increases in species in nettles, in some of the species of weeds, some same species that we see at Star-Kar. And also there are indications of disturbance of the woodland at this time. So similar changes to the environments around these sites to the ones that are happening around Star-Kar. And again, these are largely unintentional acts structuring the composition of plant communities. Now, this is just based on those areas where we have archaeology. So it's the known known Mesolithic sites. But humans would also be structuring the environments in other parts of the landscape where we can't necessarily see it archaeologically. People would be harvesting wild plants as food, and that is going to affect the propagation, the dispersal of the seeds of those things. You might start getting larger stands of certain economic plants in other parts of the landscape where people are going to harvest them. Humans are certainly changing the behaviours of animals, and this would have a subsequent effect on vegetation too. So beavers, we know they were active at Star-Kar and probably some other sites around the lake at the very start of the Mesolithic. And these wouldn't have stayed around when humans arrived. Humans are predating on beavers; they're killing them. So beavers would move to other locations around the lake, and we know they're still present in the lake because again we find beaver gnawed wood within archaeological context from this time. So beavers are moving to other parts of the lake, and as we said earlier, they're having a massive effect on the environments in these places. So they're starting to structure woodland and wetland vegetation in other parts of the lake, maybe areas that they hadn't been inhabiting before humans arrived. And the same would be true of species like red deer, roe deer, and elk. So the browsing mammals, these would also be changing their behaviour in response to the sort of more consistent presence of humans in the landscape. And this can have a massive effect on patterns of vegetation. So in the 1990s, for example, in Yellowstone Park in Wyoming in the US, humans, the introduction of wolf populations to the national park completely changed the behaviors and the patterns of movement and browsing patterns of species of elk. And this had a massive impact on the forest. In fact, people only realised that elk had changed their behaviours in the landscape because the forest started to regenerate in areas where it hadn't grown for decades. And this was simply because the elk had begun to move to different parts of the landscape, and forest began to regenerate in those areas. And the areas that the elk moved to was the park witnessed areas of woodland regression. So the woodland actually retreated from these areas. So again, around Lake Flixton, the fact that humans are active in this landscape would change the behaviour of ungulates, or of red deer, roe deer, and elk, and that is going to have also structured the environment. Now, it's difficult to define exactly how much of the landscape would be structured, either around sort of sites or through these other forms of action. But what we're looking at, certainly archaeologically, is definitely an underestimate of the extent of human action. We've only got a small number of sites in the area where we have radiocarbon chronology. So you know, of the 25 sites that were occupied in the Mesolithic, there's a good chance that some more of those were also being occupied at the same time as Star Car, and sites like Flixton Schoolhouse Farm and Flixton School Field, and these other sites that are occupied in this first millennium of the Mesolithic. And you know, human impact isn't necessarily going to mean everywhere, but it would have a significant presence on these landscapes. And this doesn't necessarily end when sites are abandoned. So, for example, we know that at Star Car, activity ends at around about 10,500 years ago. Flixton School Field, we talked briefly about that, again, ends sometime during the early Mesolithic, as do some of the other sites where we have evidence of this early Mesolithic activity. But these don't necessarily revert back to some sort of pre-human natural state. You know, the existing structure and composition of these places would affect the way that plants would grow. You might have gradual colonization of openings and disturbed areas. Ruderal diversity will probably remain high for some time, and animals are also likely to be attracted to these areas. The openings or the fresh plant growth and the young coppice is going to attract ungulates to those, or browsing species to those areas. Indigenous people describe how old settlements are really great for hunting because they attract animals, and we see hints of this in the archaeological record too. So several sites around the lake that we know were occupied early in the Mesolithic, where there would be these impacts on the environment. Later in the Mesolithic, these seem to get used for hunting. So sites around the north shore of the lake where we know there's early Mesolithic activity. Later in the Mesolithic, we find composite tools, so arrows that have been lost in the peat. There's a site where an aurochs has been hunted and killed and brought down close to one of these areas. So perhaps the reason that people start hunting in these areas later in the Mesolithic is because they are still very open areas of woodland that are attractive to animals. So what we'd see in this landscape is an environment that's a real mosaic. There would be areas of new environmental disturbance where humans are establishing new sites, because obviously humans don't leave this landscape just because they leave some of the sites, they occupy new ones. So we see areas of new environmental disturbance, freshly felled trees, newly harvested coppice, fresh ground disturbance. We'd see more established sites where humans have maybe been there for generations, which have openings in the woodlands. There'd be differences at these sites in the age and species structure of the trees. There might even be higher species diversity in these areas. We'd see also areas of deliberate plant management, such as the burning of reed beds that we see at certain sites around the lake as well. And there'd also be newly formed areas of animal impacts as animals respond to the actions of humans by moving to different parts of the lake. And also there'd be these abandoned sites that might even be being maintained to some extent by the actions of animal species like deer. And so we have to ask ourselves, I think, like, to what extent could this ever be described as a natural landscape? You know, we're seeing changes in woodland structure from the very start of the Mesolithic, which is, like I say, is only a few centuries after the end of the last ice age. So this is what we would traditionally see as a pristine or very natural landscape. We're seeing changes in the woodland structure. Potentially, we're seeing human action creating increases in biodiversity at certain sites, certainly in terms of species composition. And this is spanning the Mesolithic. So we've only really talked about the first 1,000 years of the Mesolithic, but occupation continues within this landscape throughout the period. And these changes will also have been spatially extensive as well. Even though we've only got a handful of sites with this evidence on them, other sites in the landscape are also being modified through indirect forms of human action, as I've discussed. And what's really interesting to think about is that this isn't just down to humans. This is really contingent on the actions of plants and animals as well, and the ways in which they are responding and acting back onto humans. So does this mean that Mesolithic people were the first ecologists? No, not really. Mesolithic people weren't doing this to conserve. These were, like I say, unintended, largely consequences of their actions. But I think there's interesting sort of things that we can take from thinking about the ways in which Mesolithic people interact with their environment and the way that the environment is acting back. As I said earlier, it makes us think much more about how plant and animal species aren't simply passive, and how humans aren't the only sort of beings in the world that drive change. We can use the archaeology to really make ourselves more aware of the more complex interactions and engagements between plants and animals. We can think of it as well in terms of like maybe how it might inform conservation practice. We often see humans as being very negative forces on the environment, and that's largely because of the circumstances that we live in today. We live in this period of humanly induced climatic and environmental change, which is having a massive and very detrimental impact on things like species, on biodiversity, on our environments. And we've even named our current geological epoch the Anthropocene because of this. And so, yeah, we see humans having this very negative effect on the environment. But we have to remember it's only certain communities of humans at certain points in the human past that have had this effect. Not all humans are have negative effects on the environment. Study after study is showing that indigenous communities occupy some of the most biodiverse, species-rich places on the planet, places that conservationists want to conserve. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But we can maybe think about the positive effect that humans can have on environments, and think about that in terms of our own nature conservation practices in places like Britain. So when we're thinking about woodland conservation, woodland restoration, maybe we should start thinking about putting humans into those places. We're having active coppicing going on in places, encouraging people to be more active in forests. It's good for people's health, their physical health, their mental health, and also it is good for the environment too. And thinking beyond Britain as well, nature conservation practices in places like Africa, but not just Africa, but also in the Americas and other parts of the world too. These conservation practices often exclude indigenous peoples from their own landscapes, from their own environments. And it has this because of this idea that humans are a negative force on their environment, and because of that, conservationists are deliberately excluding indigenous peoples from their landscapes. They're preventing them from living as hunter-gatherers or practicing pastoralism or small-scale agriculture in these places. And that's conservationists are doing in those landscapes because they want to preserve those landscapes. But those landscapes only exist as really species-rich, biodiverse places because of the actions of indigenous people. So again, we can maybe think about what we can see in the archaeology to advocate for indigenous communities, and how maybe we need to think very differently about the way in which we relate to them in terms of conservation. Now, I realise I've whittled on now, and I've just gone over 45 minutes. And I was just going to end by thinking about how humans recognise plant and animal agency, and how they would come to see animals as being maybe animate, sentient beings in the landscape. But I will leave that for another talk. And I'd just like to end by saying Happy New Year to everyone, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.